In 1958, a man named Joseph Williams worked in the customer research department of Bank of America. He had an idea. He printed up 65,000 plastic cards, put them in envelopes, and mailed them to residents of Fresno, California, without asking. No application, no approval process, just a card in the mailbox with a $300 limit and a note explaining how revolving credit worked. Most people had never heard the term. Bank of America expected 4% of cardholders to default. The real number was 22%. They lost approximately $20 million in the first year. They mailed out more cards anyway. Joseph Williams was fired. The card survived. You are still paying for it. Americans today carry a combined total of $18.6 trillion in household debt. The personal savings rate sits at 4.4%. In the 1960s, the average American family saved 11.7% of their income. At the peak, in May of 1975, the rate hit 17.3%. Today it is 4.4%. And this video is going to show you exactly what changed, who decided it would change, and what your grandfather understood about money, that the entire financial system spent 50 years trying to make you forget. Your grandfather didn't read this in a book. His father showed him. One envelope at a time. The system that kept ordinary Americans building real wealth did not fail. It was replaced. The envelope was not a financial strategy. It was a physical fact. Your grandmother would cash the paycheck on Friday, come home and divide the bills into labeled envelopes. Rent, groceries, electric, church, savings. The grocery envelope got its share. When it was empty, you ate what was in the pantry. No exceptions, no negotiating, no borrowing from the rent envelope. The Census Bureau documented that the median American family in 1954 earned $4,200 a year. Families at that income level were saving more than 10% annually. In absolute terms, that is less than $500 a year. But as a proportion of what they earned, it is more than double what the average American manages today on an income that, adjusted for inflation, is nearly 3 times higher. The trick was not discipline. The trick was friction. When money is physical, spending has weight. You can feel the envelope getting thinner. You can see Tuesday's dinner budget between your fingers. The act of removing cash and handing it to someone is a transaction your body registers. A credit card removes that entirely. Tap. Done. The sensation of spending disappears. That disappearance was not an accident. It was the product. Before Bank of America's card arrived, Americans who wanted to buy on credit used something called layaway. Your grandmother picked out a winter coat in October. She put $20 down at the counter. She came back each week with a few dollars more. In December, she picked it up. The coat was hers before she had ever worn it. No interest, no debt that followed her home. If she stopped making payments, she got most of her money back. The system forced patience in both directions. The retailer waited for their money. The customer waited for their product. Nobody got trapped. Then credit cards arrived, and retailers discovered something important. Customers who bought on impulse and paid interest for years were worth far more than customers who saved patiently and paid in full. The math was simple. A patient customer buying a $100 item cost the store nothing beyond the item. An impatient customer buying the same item on a credit card at 18% interest, paying only the minimum each month, would pay the store and the bank for years. Layaway did not disappear because consumers stopped wanting it. It disappeared because it was too honest a system for the people who replaced it. Walmart dropped its layaway program in 2006. In 2011, during the financial crisis, when millions of Americans lost access to credit, Walmart brought layaway back. Demand was enormous. The credit card had replaced layaway. Then the credit card crisis brought layaway back. The wheel had turned. The system didn't fail. It was discontinued. Here is what the history books rarely connect in the same sentence. The ruling came down on a December Tuesday in 1978. There was no announcement, no press conference, just a 9-page opinion from the Supreme Court of the United States that rewrote the credit market for 250 million Americans. The case was called Marquette National Bank of Minneapolis versus First of Omaha Service Corporation. It held that a nationally chartered bank could charge its customers the interest rate permitted by the state where the bank was located, regardless of the usury laws in the state where the customer lived. A bank in Nebraska could charge Minnesota residents 18%, even though Minnesota law capped rates at 12%. Your grandfather borrowed money from a banker who knew his name. After December 1978, the bank did not need to know his name anymore. It had his zip code and his state of residence, and it could charge him whatever Nebraska law allowed. Most Americans did not notice the ruling. Most Americans still have not heard of it. Delaware noticed. South Dakota noticed. Both states moved quickly to abolish their interest rate ceilings entirely. Citibank moved its credit card operations to South Dakota in 1981. Other major banks followed. Congress passed the Depository Institutions Deregulation Act in 1980. The last federal cap was gone. Banks could charge whatever they wanted. Nobody put a ceiling back. The average credit card interest rate in the 1970s ran around 17%. Today it sits at approximately 22%. The highest it has ever been, and the gap between what banks pay to borrow money and what they charge you to use, it has expanded by nearly 10 percentage points since the year 2000. Not because the cost of money increased, because the legal ceiling on what they could charge you was removed. But while usury caps were being dismantled, something quieter was happening at the same time. The tools your grandparents used to save money were being discontinued, one by one, starting with the most trusted one. Christmas clubs had existed since 1909, when a banker named Merkel Landis at the Carlyle Trust Company in Pennsylvania created the first one. Landis had a simple idea. If people cannot save a loan, the bank should hold the money for them. 350 people signed up the first year. They saved about $28 each. By Christmas, they had enough. The model spread across the country over the next 7 decades. You deposited a fixed amount every week, and the bank held it in a restricted account until December 1st. You could not withdraw it early. By the 1980s, 23 million Americans participated in Christmas Club accounts, with $6 billion sitting in those restricted accounts at the peak in 1984. The accounts paid almost no interest. Banks held the money for most of the year at essentially zero cost. Then the Depository Institutions Deregulation Act of 1980 allowed banks to offer higher yielding accounts. The Christmas Club, which paid almost no interest, suddenly looked like a bad deal for depositors. One by one, the banks closed them. The administrative overhead seemed unnecessary. The accounts quietly faded from most major institutions through the late 1980s and the 1990s. What replaced them was the credit card holiday spending cycle. Buy in November and December, carry the balance into the new year. Pay interest for the first quarter. Start the cycle again. A family that used a Christmas club paid for their holiday with money they had saved over 11 months, interest-free, with no debt attached. A family that used a credit card paid for the same holiday with borrowed money at 18 to 22% interest. For the family, the difference over a decade was thousands of dollars. For the bank, the Christmas Club was a cost center. The credit card was a profit machine. 23 million accounts, gone in a decade. Nobody noticed. Your grandfather did not have a credit score. The Fair Isaac Corporation did not create the FICO score until 1989. Before that, if you wanted to borrow money, you walked into a local bank, and a banker who knew you decided whether you were likely to pay it back. They were called character loans. Your reputation in the community was your collateral. That system had real flaws. It excluded people who lacked relationships with bankers, which often meant it excluded people who were not white. That is worth naming. But it also meant that credit decisions were made by human beings who understood context. The FICO score replaced that judgment with a formula. The formula was the same for everyone. The results were not the same. If you started with less access to credit, the score said you were a worse risk, and the score set your interest rate. Your history of exclusion became the reason you paid more. Your grandfather got a loan because a banker trusted him. You get a rate because an algorithm scored you. Same need, different owner of the relationship. Your reputation became a number. The number earned them billions. The personal savings rate in America peaked at 17.3% in May of 1975. It had spent the entire decade before that averaging above 10%. Since 1990, it has rarely exceeded 8%. Since 2005, it has mostly stayed below 5%. The United States now carries $18.6 trillion in household debt. And at the center of that transformation is not a change in human nature or a collapse of personal responsibility. It is a series of legal, regulatory, and institutional decisions made between 1958 and 1990 that systematically removed every tool that had helped ordinary Americans accumulate wealth without going into debt. Joseph Williams, the man who launched the Fresno drop in 1958 and sent 65,000 unsolicited credit cards to people who had never asked for one, was fired for the losses his program created. He did not live to see what those losses bought. The program he designed went on to become Visa, one of the most profitable financial networks in history. He got a pink slip. The bank got the empire. Your grandfather's generation built the savings habits that made the American middle class. Then, one envelope at a time, one Christmas club at a time, one layaway program at a time, the system that sustained those habits was quietly discontinued. Not because the habits were wrong, because they were not profitable enough for the right people. The math your grandmother used on a Friday afternoon in 1955 has not changed. The dirt in a kitchen garden does not charge interest. A tool you own is a service you never have to pay for again. The family that does not borrow for things it cannot yet afford does not pay the bank for the privilege of impatience. None of this requires a spreadsheet or a financial advisor or an app. It requires knowing that the system you are living inside was designed with specific incentives, and that those incentives are not yours. Your grandfather saved more than you earn, not because he was wiser, because the system around him was built differently, and because someone decided to build a different one. The question is not whether the old tools still work. They do. The question is whether you know you are allowed to use them.